As a second part to the introduction of complex numbers, namely the I, let's take a closer look at I and what would happen when you take I to the second, third, and fourth power. So we discussed the imaginary number I is equal to the square root of -1. Well, what would happen if you took I and took that to the second power? In other words, what is I squared? Well, we know that I is the square root of -1. So if we took I squared, we would then have the square root of -1 times the square root of -1, which is simply equal to just -1, a real value. What do you think would happen if we cubed I? In other words, we took I to the third power. Well, then we would just have the square root of -1 times the square root of -1 times the square root of -1. But we already said that the square root of -1 times the square root of -1 gives us just -1. And then we also said that the square root of -1 is the imaginary number I. So now we have -1I, or simply -I. How about I to the fourth power? Do you think it'll just be -1? Well, let's explore that. So we know that I to the fourth power is simply the square root of -1 times itself 4 times. So in other words, we have the square root of -1 times the square root of -1 times the square root of -1 times the square root of -1. Well, we said that the square root of -1 times itself is just -1, and here we have it twice. And so now we have -1 times -1, which we know to be +1. Notice how we go from imaginary to real, back to imaginary, back to real. The question is there a discernible pattern at this point? What happens when we take I to the 5th, or I to the 6th, or I to the 10th, 100th, so on and so forth? This can be a discussion that we'll have in class.